Right now, while you are hearing these words, science classrooms across the world are teaching two different official counts of how many planets circle our sun, and both counts are technically defensible. 20 years ago this coming month, in a conference hall in Prague built to hold thousands, that contradiction began. It was the 10th and final day of a meeting that had run for almost 2 weeks straight, and by then more than half the seats sat empty because most of the astronomers who had filled that hall a week earlier were already home, unaware that a vote about to happen without them would end up rewriting textbooks for generations of children none of them would ever meet. No cameras were rolling, and no press conference had been scheduled to make it official. Only a few hundred people were still in their seats, each one holding a small square of yellow card, waiting for a signal to raise it. This was not a courtroom. It was not a laboratory. It was a hotel conference center with folding chairs about to decide a scientific question by a show of hands and a stack of colored cardboard. What they were deciding had nothing to do with a new discovery or a new photograph from space. It came down to a single word, and to whether a small, frozen world found by a broke, self-taught 24-year-old working alone in the Arizona desert in 1930 still deserved to wear it. This is the story of the day Pluto lost its status as a planet, and of an argument that, 20 years later, still has not ended. This channel exists to walk through what the evidence and the historical record actually show, not to manufacture a tidy verdict, because a tidy verdict performs better. If that sounds like your kind of channel, consider subscribing, because there's more of this coming. For now, go back a lot further than Prague, to a hailstorm in Kansas and a boy who could not afford to go to college. Clyde Tombaugh grew up on farms in Kansas, not near a university. In 1928, a hailstorm wiped out his family's crops the same year he had hoped to start college, and there was no money left to send him. So instead of a classroom, Tombaugh taught himself astronomy. He ground his own telescope lenses by hand, dug a pit in his yard to test mirrors and still air, and mailed his own drawings of Jupiter and Mars to the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, hoping someone there might notice. Someone did. At 23 years old, with no college degree at all, he was hired to do one of the most tedious jobs in astronomy, photographing the same patch of night sky on different nights, then flipping back and forth between the plates on a machine called a blink comparator, watching for one point of light that had moved when nothing else had. He worked this way before satellites existed, before computers existed, before anyone had sent so much as a signal past the moon. Most nights produced nothing. On the 18th of February, 1930, comparing plates taken weeks apart, one point finally jumped. Tombaugh, 24 years old, had found a ninth world circling the sun. An 11-year-old English schoolgirl named Venetia Burney suggested the name over breakfast with her grandfather, who passed the idea to an astronomer who cabled it to Arizona 3 days after the discovery was announced. Pluto, named in part for the god of the underworld, and in part through its first two letters for Percival Lowell, the man whose observatory had spent a quarter of a century searching for it before Tombaugh ever arrived. If you have ever wondered why Pluto's old planetary symbol looks like two overlapping letters, now you know whose initials they spell. For the next 76 years, Pluto held its place. If you are old enough to remember memorizing 9 planets in a classroom, drawing them on a poster, or building a solar system model out of painted styrofoam balls hanging from wire, you were never asked to defend that number because nobody needed to defend it. There were 9 planets, everyone agreed, and the word planet did not require a legal definition any more than the word chair needs one before you sit in it. That certainty lasted until astronomers started finding company for Pluto out past Neptune. Through the 1990s, astronomers confirmed a wide belt of icy debris beyond Neptune called the Kuiper Belt, and Pluto turned out to be only one resident of a much larger neighborhood. Then, on the 21st of October, 2003, a telescope at Palomar Observatory in California photographed a faint point of light that a team led by astronomer Mike Brown, working with Chad Trujillo and David Rabinowitz, would not properly confirm for nearly 2 more years. Once they were certain, they nicknamed it Xena, after the television warrior princess, and sat on the discovery while they finished the science. Word leaked anyway, and on the 29th of July, 2005, the team announced it to the world. Here was an object out past Pluto that appeared, by every early measurement, to be larger than Pluto itself. If Pluto counted as a planet, astronomers suddenly had a 10th one on their hands, and probably more waiting behind it. That was the actual crisis. Not a monster, not an invasion, just an honest measurement that finally forced professional astronomers to answer a question they had spent 75 years avoiding. What exactly counts as a planet? Nobody had ever needed to define the word carefully, because for 3/4 of a century the answer had simply been the list everyone already knew by heart. Now the list itself was the problem, and the International Astronomical Union, the body responsible for officially naming and classifying objects in space, would have to settle it in Prague the following year. In August of 2006, the International Astronomical Union held its triennial General Assembly in Prague. a meeting that ran for 10 days and drew astronomers from across the world. A committee chaired by Owen Gingerich, a historian and astronomer at Harvard, had spent months trying to write a scientific definition of the word planet, and on the 16th of August, they presented their answer to the full assembly. It was bold. Under their draft, the solar system would gain 3 new planets overnight: Ceres, the largest object in the asteroid belt; Charon, previously considered only Pluto's moon; and the newly discovered world nicknamed Xena. That would make 12 planets, with a dozen more candidates already waiting in line behind them. For a little while, it looked like the count was only going to grow. It did not survive contact with the rest of the room. Astronomers raised 2 serious objections. The proposed definition leaned on a body simply being round, which describes hundreds of objects in the outer solar system, and would keep expanding the planet count for as long as telescopes kept improving. And the draft would have promoted Charon to a planet in its own right, which struck many astronomers as backwards, since Charon and Pluto orbit a shared point in space, rather than one clearly circling the other. 2 Uruguayan astronomers, Gonzalo Tancredi and Julio Fernandez, proposed an alternative that added a third requirement beyond roundness and orbiting the sun, that a planet also had to have cleared its own orbital neighborhood of competing debris. In an informal show of hands on the 18th of August, only about 18 astronomers still backed the 12-planet draft. More than 50 favored scrapping it for the Uruguayan version instead. The compromise that would have kept Pluto and promoted 2 other worlds alongside it was dead within 2 days of being written. That left the harder version on the table, and it went to a final vote on the 10th and final day of the assembly, the 24th of August. That is the exact room the story opened in, minutes before the vote. By that point, in a 10-day meeting, attendance always thins. Astronomers have flights booked and telescope time waiting back home, and a conference hall that held thousands during the opening days had emptied out considerably by the closing one. When the vote was finally called, only 424 astronomers were present to cast one, out of a worldwide professional membership of roughly 10,000. Picture a stadium built to seat 10,000 people, with only a few hundred of them actually sitting in their seats when the deciding play happens. Everyone else finds out later, from a headline. The vote itself happened in stages. First, the assembly approved the new definition of a planet almost unanimously. A planet orbits the sun, is round because its own gravity has pulled it into a stable shape, and has cleared its orbital neighborhood of smaller competing objects. Then came the specific question of what to do with Pluto under that new rule, and this is where the room actually split. The final tally was 237 in favor of reclassifying Pluto as a dwarf planet, 157 opposed, and 30 abstaining, a separate amendment that would have kept an umbrella category called classical planets. Softening the blow failed too, drawing only 91 votes in support. Even the name for Pluto's new category was contested. A proposal to call these worlds Plutonian objects lost by 3 votes, 186 against 183 in favor. Nothing about that day was a landslide. It was a genuinely close, genuinely contested decision, made by a few hundred exhausted people near the end of a long meeting, and it has shaped what generations of school children have been taught ever since. The public reaction arrived almost immediately, and it was not measured. Newspapers ran the story as Pluto being demoted, kicked out, or downgraded, language none of the actual resolution used, but all of it stuck. The International Astronomical Union faced real public anger, and by its own later account, considerable uproar, much of it from ordinary people defending a planet most of them had never questioned before that week. Petitions circulated. Science teachers had to retire a decades-old classroom trick for remembering the planets in order, a sentence where the first letter of each word matched a planet's name, because the sentence no longer had anywhere to put its final word. By the end of that same year, the American Dialect Society, a group of linguists who track how the English language actually changes, voted to Pluto as its word of the year, defining it plainly as to demote or devalue, exactly what had just happened to Pluto itself. None of that changed the resolution, but it revealed something the astronomers in that half-empty room may not have fully accounted for. For millions of people, Pluto was never really a scientific classification. It was a memory, something you learned once as a plain fact of childhood and never expected to see change. Not every scientist accepted the outcome either, and the loudest of them was Alan Stern, a planetary scientist who happened to be leading NASA's own mission to Pluto at the time. Stern had helped launch New Horizons only months before the Prague vote, a spacecraft built specifically to reach the world the Assembly had just voted to downgrade. His response was blunt. He said the new definition was, in his own words, an awful definition, sloppy science that would never pass peer review. His argument was technical, and on its own terms, hard to dismiss outright. The rule requires a planet to have cleared its orbital neighborhood of competing debris, but by a strict reading, Earth has not cleared every asteroid that crosses its path, and neither has Mars, Jupiter, or Neptune. If If the standard were applied with total consistency, Stern argued, several planets nobody was proposing to demote would technically fail it too. As the mission's principal investigator, Stern stated plainly that New Horizons itself would not recognize the resolution the Assembly had adopted that day. A striking position for a NASA-led project to take against the very body that names objects in space. Stern's objection was not only rhetorical. Years earlier, in 2002, he and fellow astronomer Harold Levison had already proposed a different way of thinking about the word planet altogether, based on geology rather than orbital mechanics. Under their approach, refined further in 2018 with planetary scientist Kirby Runyon, a planet is any body massive enough for its own gravity to pull it into a round shape that has never undergone nuclear fusion like a star, regardless of where it orbits or what else shares its neighborhood. Apply that rule consistently across the solar system, and the count does not shrink to 8. It grows to roughly 36, adding Pluto back, along with fellow dwarf planets like Eris, Ceres, Haumea, and Makemake, and adding 19 moons besides, including Saturn's Titan, Jupiter's 4 largest moons, Neptune's Triton, and the moon hanging over your own house tonight. Under Stern's definition, you have technically been living beside a planet your entire life without anyone telling you. Mike Brown, the astronomer whose discovery had started the entire crisis, ended up completely comfortable with the outcome, and his reasoning deserves the same fair hearing Stern's does. When his team first announced their new world in July of 2005, early measurements suggested it was larger than Pluto, which is exactly what forced the argument to happen at all. More careful measurements years later actually reversed part of that story. The object, officially named Eris, after the Greek goddess of strife and discord, a fitting choice given what it caused, turned out to be very slightly smaller than Pluto across its diameter, but denser and about 27% more massive. Even the two objects at the center of this entire fight could not be cleanly ranked against each other without careful measurement, which was Brown's whole point. Eris's own moon, discovered that same year and eventually named Dysnomia after the mythological daughter of Eris, the goddess of lawlessness, carried an accidental echo of the old nickname too, since the actress who played the television warrior princess Xena happened to be named Lucy Lawless. Brown later wrote a book about the episode called How I Killed Pluto and Why It Had It Coming. And its argument, stripped of the provocative title, is a coherent one. If roundness alone qualifies something as a planet, the solar system does not gain a handful of new members. It gains dozens, possibly hundreds, as better telescopes keep finding more round, icy bodies in the Kuiper Belt. At some point, Brown has argued, a category that includes nearly everything stops usefully describing anything. The dynamical definition, the one that survived the vote, preserves a small, functionally distinct group, the handful of bodies whose gravity is strong enough to have cleared and now dominates its own orbital lane around the Sun. That is a real, measurable difference between Earth and Pluto, whatever else the two worlds might share. Both Stern and Brown are correct about the thing each of them is actually measuring. They are simply measuring different things, and calling both of them by the same word, planet, was probably always going to cause exactly this kind of argument. Tombaugh never lived to see any of this argument happen. He died in January of 1997, still convinced there might be more to find past the world he had discovered. But in a strange, literal sense, part of him made the trip anyway. New Horizons launched from Cape Canaveral on the 19th of January 2006, 7 months before the Prague vote, riding an Atlas rocket fast enough to become the quickest human-made object ever sent away from Earth. It passed the orbit of the Moon in only 9 hours. The Apollo astronauts, covering the same distance a generation earlier, had needed the better part of 3 days. A year into the flight, a close pass by Jupiter bent the spacecraft's path and added still more speed, shaving a further 3 years off the total trip. Sealed inside the spacecraft was about 1 ounce of Clyde Tombaugh's ashes, along with an inscription describing him as the discoverer of Pluto in the solar system's third zone, and further down, simply as a teacher, a punster, and a friend. The man who found the world spent the next 9.5 years riding toward it anyway, whatever the astronomers in Prague eventually decided to call it. New Horizons reached Pluto on the 14th of July 2015, passing within about 7,800 miles of the surface, a distance not much greater than flying across the continental United States 3 times in a row. If you were paying attention to the news that week, you likely remember the first close images arriving. A small, cold world the internet had spent 9 years arguing over, suddenly turning out to have a face. What New Horizons found changed the entire emotional shape of this argument, even though it changed nothing about the vote itself. Pluto was not the dead, static ball of ice most textbooks implied. Its most striking feature, an enormous pale, heart-shaped plain now informally called Tombaugh Regio, contains a smooth region so free of impact craters that scientists estimate it cannot be older than about 10 million years, which on a world 4.5 billion years old is close to brand new. mountain ranges of solid water ice, named Hillary Montes and Norgay Montes after the first two men to summit Mount Everest, rise several miles into Pluto's thin sky, standing as tall as some of the highest peaks in the Rocky Mountains. Two features that resemble volcanoes, Wright Mons and Pickard Mons, suggest the world may have oozed icy material up from underneath itself within the last few million years, not billions of years ago. And Charon, the moon that the 12-planet draft had once tried to promote into its own category, turned out to share its center of gravity with Pluto at a point that floats in open space above Pluto's surface, never quite touching either world, which is why some astronomers still argue the two of them are better described as a double planet than a planet and a moon. None of that was known in the room in Prague. The vote happened 9 years before anyone had a real photograph of Pluto's surface at all. New Horizons did not stop at Pluto either. NASA extended the mission, and on the 1st of January, 2019, the same spacecraft that carried Tombaw's ashes flew past a small, distant world called Arrokoth, deep in the Kuiper Belt and far beyond anything Tombaugh himself could have imagined seeing up close. The most distant object any spacecraft has ever examined this way. Arrokoth turned out to be two icy lobes, fused gently together into a shape almost like a snowman tumbling slowly through the dark, so fragile that it could only have formed through the gentlest possible collision billions of years ago at barely more than walking speed. Nobody in that room in Prague had any way to know that the machine carrying part of Pluto's discoverer would keep going for years after the paperwork was settled, quietly examining a world even older and stranger than the one the entire argument had been about. The disagreement was never really contained to one small, cold world either. Astronomers have now confirmed several thousand planets orbiting other stars. A great many of them fit no comfortable category at all. Worlds larger than Neptune but smaller than Jupiter. Worlds so close to their own star that a year lasts only a few days. Worlds drifting alone through interstellar space with no star to orbit at all. The same messy problem that surfaced in Prague in 2006, deciding exactly where a planet stops being a planet, has only grown bigger since, and the International Astronomical Union has never seriously reopened its own definition to fix it. 20 years after the vote, the disagreement has not closed. Alan Stern, still working on New Horizons data today, has never accepted the outcome and continues publishing under the geophysical definition professionally. A meaningful share of planetary geologists, the scientists who study surfaces and interiors up close rather than orbital mechanics from a distance, still call Pluto a planet in their own published papers, whatever the International Astronomical Union's rulebook says. Mike Brown, for his part, spent the years after 2006 looking for something else entirely. In early 2016, working with fellow Caltech astronomer Konstantin Batygin, he co-proposed evidence for a genuine undiscovered ninth planet, a massive world far beyond Neptune whose gravity appears to be quietly shaping the orbits of several smaller distant objects. Its existence remains unconfirmed, but the man most associated with taking a planet away from the solar system has spent a decade since trying to hand one back. The public never fully accepted the ruling either. This channel's own video about Pluto has drawn more than 1,200,000 views, and its single most agreed with comment, carrying 1,400 likes, argues in 4 words that Pluto should be made a planet again. That sentiment shows no sign of fading with time. If anything, it has calcified into a kind of quiet, permanent objection, the sort of thing people bring up at dinner tables and school reunions decades after the fact, the way you might still argue about a decision made by a group you were never actually part of. None of this is even the first time astronomy has done this. Ceres, the largest object in the asteroid belt, was discovered on the 1st of January, 1801, by the Sicilian astronomer Giuseppe Piazzi, and for more than 50 years afterward, it was listed as a planet in observatories and textbooks right alongside Earth and Jupiter. Only once more objects turned up sharing its orbital neighborhood did astronomers quietly move Ceres into a new category called asteroids, without a vote, without a conference, and without the public much noticing at all. When the International Astronomical Union met in Prague in 2006, Ceres was reclassified a second time into the very same new category as Pluto, dwarf planet, closing a loop that had actually started almost 2 centuries earlier. Pluto was not singled out. It was simply the most beloved member of a pattern that had already played out once before, quietly, to a world nobody alive had ever grown up memorizing. So, which side is right? Put plainly, neither position is wrong, and this channel is not going to pretend otherwise just to give this story a tidier ending. Under the strict dynamical rule the International Astronomical Union adopted in Prague, a rule concerned with how a body behaves within its orbital neighborhood, Pluto is a dwarf planet, and so are Eris, Ceres, and several others. Under the geophysical, structural rule that Stern and a meaningful portion of the planetary science community still prefer, a rule concerned with what a world actually is up close, Pluto is a planet, And so are dozens of moons. Nobody in a classroom was ever taught to think of that way. Both definitions are internally consistent. Both were written by serious scientists trying to solve an honest problem. They simply chose to answer different questions and mistook, for a while, that they were arguing about the same one. Picture that hall in Prague one more time. On the 10th day, mostly empty, a few hundred tired astronomers raising small yellow cards to settle an argument that a farm boy from Kansas, an 11-year-old girl from Oxford, and a man who had spent a quarter century searching the sky before either of them were born had all, in their own way, already had a hand in starting. None of them got a vote that day. The card in the air only ever really decided how the paperwork would read. It never decided what Pluto actually is, because that was never really a question a vote could answer in the first place. 20 years on, the argument has outlived the meeting, outlived the headlines, and outlived most of the astronomers who raised a card that day. It is the kind of argument that outlives everyone who ever has an opinion about it. If you want more stories that sit with an honest argument instead of handing you a false winner, consider subscribing, because there are several more anniversaries like this one coming. Mike Brown, the man most blamed for ending Pluto's run as a planet, is out there right now, still searching for a real one to replace it. And that search alone is worth its own story someday. Thanks for watching, and take care.